What if the collapse of trillions of dollars did not happen in some abstract market, but inside a single building, behind glass walls, polished floors, and quiet boardrooms in the heart of Manhattan? What if the greatest financial disaster of the modern era was not born from chaos, but from routine decisions made every day by people who believed the system would always protect them? As you listen to this story, leave a comment with your first impression. Do you believe financial empires collapse suddenly, or do they rot slowly from the inside? Before continuing, if you value deep documentary narratives like this one, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write your thoughts below. Your comment helps this story reach more people who want to understand how power truly works. Lehman Brothers did not begin as a monster of global finance. It was founded in 1850 by Henry Lehman, a German immigrant who opened a modest trading business in Alabama, dealing primarily in cotton. Over decades, the firm evolved, adapting to the shifting economic landscape of the United States, surviving wars, depressions, and transformations that destroyed countless competitors. By the late 20th century, Lehman Brothers had become something entirely different from its humble origins, an investment bank whose influence extended across continents, markets, and governments. Its headquarters in New York, especially its operations concentrated in Manhattan, were more than office spaces. They were command centers. Inside these buildings, thousands of employees worked across trading floors, risk departments, executive suites, and conference rooms where decisions were made that moved enormous sums of money with a few keystrokes. Every day, trillions of dollars flowed through screens, contracts, and financial instruments that most ordinary people would never see, let alone understand. From the outside, the headquarters projected confidence, control, and permanence. But inside, something far more dangerous was taking shape. During the final decades of the 20th century and the early years of the new millennium, Lehman Brothers embraced an aggressive vision of growth. The bank immersed itself deeply in mortgage-backed securities, complex derivatives, and structured financial products that promised high returns with supposedly manageable risk. Housing prices kept rising, credit remained cheap, and demand for these products seemed endless. Inside the headquarters, risk models displayed reassuring numbers, and optimism became institutional culture. How often do powerful organizations mistake momentum for safety? Lehman's executives believed they had mastered the art of leverage. The bank borrowed enormous amounts of money to amplify profits, operating with thin margins for error. These strategies were debated, approved, and normalized within meeting rooms and executive floors, where short-term performance mattered more than distant consequences. Losses were not eliminated. They were delayed, shifted, and disguised through accounting practices that complied with the letter of the law while betraying its spirit. Inside those walls, risk did not feel reckless. It felt routine. As the housing market began to weaken in 2007, warning signs appeared. Mortgage defaults increased, asset values wavered, and confidence quietly eroded. Yet inside Lehman Brothers headquarters, the response was not retreat, but persistence. Executives reassured staff and investors, insisting the situation was temporary. Deals continued, exposure grew. The physical space itself became a container for denial, where bad news was absorbed, softened, and reframed before it could disrupt the narrative of strength. How many warning signals can be ignored before collapse becomes unavoidable? By 2008, the tension inside the firm intensified. Negotiations with potential buyers and discussions with government officials took place under immense pressure. Every hallway conversation, every emergency meeting, every late-night decision inside the headquarters carried the weight of a global system balanced on the edge. The building that once symbolized financial dominance now held something far more volatile, accumulated risk with no clear exit. This is where the illusion finally began to fracture, not in public markets, but within the very rooms where confidence had been manufactured for years. And as the days passed, the question was no longer whether Lehman Brothers could survive, but how much damage would occur when it failed. The story does not end here. What unfolded next inside those headquarters would send shockwaves across the entire world, and the consequences would redefine global finance in ways few could have imagined at the time. Inside Lehman Brothers headquarters, the atmosphere in early 2008 shifted from quiet confidence to controlled urgency. The trading floor still buzzed with activity, screens flashing prices and charts as they always had, but beneath the surface, conversations changed tone. Senior managers moved between offices with folders held tight, voices lowered, doors closed more often than before. The machinery of the bank was still running, yet it was running on belief rather than stability. And belief, once cracked, can fail faster than any balance sheet. The core of the problem was no longer abstract. Vast amounts of mortgage-related assets sat on Lehman's books, many of them tied to subprime loans that were now unraveling. These assets were technically still valued as profitable, but their real market worth was becoming increasingly uncertain. Inside the headquarters, teams worked tirelessly to defend those valuations, using internal models that assumed housing prices would stabilize. The question few dared to ask openly was simple: what if those assumptions were wrong? Meetings became longer, more frequent, and more defensive. Executives debated how much information to reveal, how much to conceal, and how much could be postponed until conditions improved. The building itself became a pressure chamber. Each floor carried its own version of reality, from traders focused on surviving the day to executives focused on preserving confidence at any cost. How often does an institution confuse transparency with weakness? Lehman Brothers had survived crises before, and that history bred dangerous certainty. Inside the headquarters, there was a deeply ingrained belief that the government would never allow a firm of such size and interconnectedness to fail. This assumption shaped decisions more than any risk metric. Leverage remained high. Exposure continued. The logic was unspoken but powerful. Even if things turned bad, someone would step in. That belief echoed through boardrooms and strategy sessions like an invisible safety net. As summer approached, liquidity tightened. Counterparties grew nervous, demanding more collateral or refusing to roll over short-term funding. What had once been routine transactions became negotiations filled with hesitation. Inside Lehman's offices, emergency teams worked to secure financing, sell assets, or spin off divisions. Every option came with consequences, and every consequence threatened the image the bank had spent decades constructing. Saving face became inseparable from saving the firm. By late August, the headquarters felt different. There was no panic in the open, but tension clung to the air. Employees sensed that something fundamental was breaking, even if official communications remained optimistic. Emails from leadership emphasized resilience, strength, and long-term vision, while internal discussions revolved around survival. Can an institution remain functional when its internal story no longer matches reality? Negotiations with potential buyers intensified. Representatives from other financial giants walked through Lehman's offices, reviewed its books, and assessed the damage. Each visit carried hope, followed by disappointment. The numbers did not add up. The risks were too concentrated. Inside the headquarters, optimism narrowed with every failed deal. The building that once hosted celebrations of record profits now witnessed quiet moments of realization. Government officials became frequent participants in late-night calls and closed-door meetings. The question dominating these discussions was unprecedented. Should Lehman Brothers be saved or allowed to fail? Within the headquarters, executives waited, calculating scenarios that no spreadsheet could fully capture. They understood that the fate of the firm was no longer entirely in their hands, yet their past decisions had already shaped the options available. As the first weeks of September arrived, time compressed. Decisions that once took months were forced into hours. Trust evaporated faster than liquidity. Inside those walls, the accumulation of years of risk reached a critical point, and the illusion of control began to dissolve. The headquarters stood firm, but the structure it represented was already cracking. What happened next would not only determine the end of Lehman Brothers, but would ignite a chain reaction that would freeze global finance itself, turning a corporate failure into a worldwide economic shock. The final weekend before the collapse unfolded almost entirely inside and around Lehman Brothers headquarters. By Friday, September 12, 2008, the building had become a nerve center of desperation. Conference rooms were occupied around the clock, lights remained on through the night, and exhaustion blurred the line between strategic thinking and wishful hope. What was once a place of calculated confidence now functioned like an emergency bunker, shielding those inside from the scale of what was about to happen. Executives gathered with representatives from the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve, searching for a solution that would keep the firm alive without setting a precedent the government feared. The idea of a rescue without public money was discussed repeatedly. Potential buyers were pressured to reconsider, Balance sheets were re-examined, assets revalued, and worst-case scenarios quietly acknowledged. Inside the headquarters, the future of global finance was being negotiated one meeting at a time. One of the most devastating realizations emerged during these talks. Lehman's problems were too large and too complex to be neatly isolated. Its exposure to mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, and leveraged positions had woven the firm deeply into the financial system. Saving Lehman meant absorbing risks no institution wanted to claim. Allowing it to fail meant testing whether the system could survive the shock. How do leaders choose when every option leads to uncertainty? Throughout the building, employees sensed the gravity of the moment. Many remained at their desks late into the night, refreshing news feeds, waiting for internal updates or simply refusing to leave until clarity arrived. Some had spent their entire careers within those walls, believing the firm was unbreakable. Now silence between announcements felt heavier than any market crash. The headquarters was no longer just a workplace, it was a holding space for collective disbelief. By Sunday evening, negotiations collapsed. No buyer stepped forward. The government refused to provide direct support. Inside Lehman Brothers headquarters, the conclusion was unavoidable. Preparations began for bankruptcy. Legal teams worked urgently to organize filings, secure data, and manage communications. Years of accumulated leverage, risk, and delayed decisions had converged into a single irreversible outcome. In the early hours of September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers officially filed for bankruptcy, listing more than $600 billion in assets. The announcement did not come with dramatic speeches or public gatherings inside the headquarters. It arrived quietly, almost clinically, through emails, legal documents, and internal briefings. Yet its impact would be anything but quiet. Within minutes, global markets reacted with shock and confusion. Inside the building, employees learned their fate in fragmented ways. Some were told their jobs were gone. Others were instructed to remain until further notice. Security protocols were tightened. Access badges were deactivated. Personal belongings were packed into boxes. The headquarters that once symbolized financial supremacy now hosted scenes of sudden loss, disbelief, and silence. What does it feel like to watch an empire vanish from the inside? Outside those walls, the consequences spread at terrifying speed. Banks stopped trusting each other. Credit markets froze. Stock exchanges around the world plunged. Institutions that had relied on Lehman's guarantees, trades, and contracts faced immediate uncertainty. The failure of one investment bank triggered a chain reaction that revealed how fragile the global financial system had become. Yet the epicenter of this shock remained physical and specific. It was not an abstract collapse. It was the direct result of decisions made in identifiable rooms by identifiable people inside a single headquarters. The building did not crumble, but the assumptions built within it did. And as markets reeled, one question echoed across governments and financial institutions alike. Had this collapse exposed a flaw too deep to repair? The answer would unfold in the days and months that followed as the world struggled to contain the damage unleashed from one place. In the days immediately following the bankruptcy, Lehman Brothers headquarters transformed again, this time into a symbol of aftermath rather than crisis. The markets had reacted violently, but inside the building the chaos was quieter, procedural, and relentless. Teams of lawyers, accountants, and administrators moved through offices cataloging assets, securing records, and preserving data that would soon be dissected by courts, regulators, and investigators. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It was being documented line by line, room by room. The physical space revealed the scale of what had been built and lost. Trading floors filled with idle screens, conference rooms stacked with unopened reports, executive offices still arranged for decisions that would never be made. Each floor represented a layer of complexity that had once fueled growth but now complicated resolution. The headquarters stood intact, yet it contained a financial structure so intertwined that unraveling it would take years. How does one dismantle an institution that touched nearly every corner of the global economy? As bankruptcy proceedings began, attention turned to how risk had been managed inside Lehman Brothers. Internal documents showed a pattern of optimism reinforced by selective interpretation of data. Losses were frequently offset on paper by assumptions of future recovery. Accounting techniques allowed troubled assets to be temporarily removed from balance sheets, creating the illusion of stability during critical moments. These practices were debated, approved, and normalized within the same walls now being scrutinized. The collapse forced an uncomfortable question into the open. Where does aggressive strategy end and deception begin? Regulators and policymakers examined the headquarters not just as a building, but as a system of decision-making. Meetings held years earlier were reinterpreted in the light of failure. Emails once considered routine became evidence. The culture that rewarded short-term gains over long-term resilience was no longer invisible. It was measurable, traceable, and deeply embedded in daily operations. The disaster did not result from a single mistake, but from a sequence of choices that each appeared reasonable when viewed in isolation. Across the world, governments scrambled to prevent further failures. Emergency measures were introduced, banks were supported, and liquidity was injected into markets at unprecedented levels. Yet none of these actions could erase the psychological damage caused by Lehman's fall. Trust, once assumed, now had to be justified. Inside the former headquarters, this loss of trust was tangible. The institution that once set standards had become a warning. Former employees reflected on how normal everything had felt until the final moments. The routines, the confidence, the language of control all persisted right up to the brink. Many realized only afterward how insulated they had been from doubt. The headquarters had functioned as both a workplace and a filter, shaping perception as much as performance. When risk is normalized daily, it stops feeling like risk at all. The bankruptcy also exposed how concentrated power had been within a relatively small group of decision-makers. Strategic choices affecting trillions of dollars were made by individuals operating under intense pressure, competitive incentives, and cultural expectations. The physical closeness of executives, traders, and analysts created speed, but it also amplified shared blind spots. Inside those walls, consensus often mattered more than contradiction. As investigations expanded, the question of accountability grew louder. Could individuals be held responsible for systemic failure? Or was the collapse the inevitable outcome of a financial architecture that rewarded excess while disguising vulnerability? The headquarters, once a monument to success, now served as a case study in how complexity can obscure consequences until it is too late. The story of Lehman Brothers was no longer just about one bank. It became a mirror reflecting the risks embedded in modern capitalism itself. And as the world adjusted to a new financial reality, the legacy of what happened inside those offices continued to shape regulations, markets, and public trust in institutions meant to safeguard stability. Yet even this was not the end of the story. The ripple effects of decisions made within Lehman's headquarters would continue to influence economies, policies, and lives for years to come, revealing that the true cost of collapse extended far beyond a single moment in time. As the global financial system struggled to stabilize, the invisible influence of Lehman Brothers headquarters continued to surface in unexpected ways. Contracts signed years earlier, risk exposures once considered manageable, and interconnected obligations now demanded attention. Banks, hedge funds, pension systems, and even municipalities discovered that their fortunes had been quietly linked to decisions made inside those offices. The collapse was not contained within one institution. It radiated outward, revealing how deeply modern finance had become intertwined. Inside regulatory agencies and central banks, emergency meetings multiplied. New rules were drafted at unprecedented speed, aiming to prevent a repeat of such a failure. Yet behind these reforms was a sobering realization. The models that governed global finance had underestimated human behavior. Inside Lehman's headquarters, incentives had encouraged confidence over caution, innovation over restraint. Could any system truly regulate ambition when success itself rewrites the rules? Former executives defended their choices by pointing to industry norms. They argued that Lehman had not acted alone, that similar strategies were widespread across Wall Street. In many ways, this was true. The headquarters had functioned not as an anomaly, but as a concentrated expression of a broader culture. What made Lehman different was not recklessness alone, but timing. When the tide turned, it stood too exposed, too leveraged, and too isolated to survive. Meanwhile, ordinary employees faced personal consequences that statistics could not capture. Careers built over decades ended abruptly. Financial security vanished alongside professional identity. For many, the headquarters had been more than a workplace. It was a symbol of achievement, stability, and belonging. Watching it become synonymous with failure forced a painful reassessment of what institutional loyalty truly means. Across the media, images of Lehman Brothers offices circulated endlessly. Commentators spoke of greed, excess, and arrogance, often reducing a complex story to simple moral lessons. Yet, inside the building, the reality had been far more nuanced. Decisions were rarely framed as destructive in the moment they were made. They were incremental, justified, and supported by data that appeared sound. How often does disaster emerge not from one wrong move, but from many reasonable ones stacked together? Academics and economists analyzed the collapse in detail, turning internal practices into case studies. Risk management frameworks were rewritten. Stress tests became more severe. Transparency was elevated as a guiding principle. Still, one uncomfortable truth remained. Lehman Brothers had followed many of the rules as they existed at the time. The headquarters did not operate in secrecy. It operated within a system that failed to recognize its own fragility. As years passed, the building itself took on a different meaning. It became a landmark of caution, a reminder that scale does not equal security. New tenants would eventually occupy similar spaces, pursuing profit with renewed awareness of the past. Yet memory fades and markets evolve. The question lingered quietly beneath every reform and regulation: had the lessons truly been learned or merely absorbed temporarily? Inside financial institutions worldwide, echoes of Lehman's fall influenced daily decisions. Risk committees referenced it. Executives invoked it during moments of doubt. But culture has a way of drifting back toward excess when fear subsides. The headquarters had once shown how quickly confidence can transform into catastrophe when growth is treated as destiny rather than possibility. The story continued to unfold, not as history alone, but as an ongoing influence shaping how power, money, and responsibility interact. And as the world moved forward, the shadow of that collapse remained, challenging every institution to confront a difficult question. When the next crisis comes, will it be recognized in time or normalized until it is unstoppable? With time, the collapse of Lehman Brothers began to be understood less as a singular failure and more as a structural revelation. Inside the former headquarters, what had once been praised as innovation was re-examined as complexity without accountability. Financial instruments had grown so intricate that responsibility dissolved across departments, models, and committees. No single room held the whole picture, yet every room contributed to the outcome. This fragmentation became one of the most enduring lessons of the crisis. Risk management, once treated as a technical function, was exposed as a cultural one. Inside Lehman, risk officers existed. Reports were generated and limits were discussed, but their authority was often secondary to revenue generation. When warnings conflicted with profit, profit usually won. The headquarters had rewarded those who expanded positions, not those who questioned them. In such an environment, caution struggled to survive. This realization reshaped how institutions talked about governance. Boardrooms across the world revisited their own structures, asking whether dissent was truly encouraged or merely tolerated. At Lehman, internal disagreements had existed, but they rarely altered the direction of the firm. Momentum had become policy. The building itself, with its layered hierarchies and fast-paced communication, accelerated decisions while dulling reflection. Speed became a substitute for certainty. Public trust in financial institutions suffered a deep fracture. For many observers, Lehman's collapse confirmed a belief that modern finance had detached itself from real economic value. Inside the headquarters, trillions of dollars had moved daily without producing tangible goods, while the consequences of failure were borne by ordinary citizens. This disconnect fueled political backlash, protests, and calls for systemic reform. The story of one building became a symbol of imbalance between power and responsibility. Legal proceedings dragged on for years, tracing obligations, liabilities, and losses across borders. The complexity of Lehman's operations made resolution painfully slow. Assets were frozen, claims disputed, and value eroded by time itself. What had once been optimized for efficiency now proved resistant to unwinding. The headquarters, designed to coordinate vast networks, had inadvertently helped create a structure too interconnected to fail gracefully. Former leaders reflected publicly, often expressing regret without admitting fault. Some insisted they had acted rationally given the information available. Others acknowledged that incentives distorted judgment. These reflections raised a deeper question about leadership under uncertainty. When success reinforces belief, how does one recognize the moment when belief becomes blindness? The collapse also altered how society perceived expertise. Financial models, once treated with near reverence, lost their aura of infallibility. Inside Lehman, reliance on quantitative assurances had overshadowed qualitative judgment. Numbers provided comfort, even when reality shifted beneath them. The headquarters had become a place where complexity masked vulnerability, convincing those inside that risk was measurable even when it was not. Education systems incorporated Lehman into curricula, teaching future bankers, economists, and policymakers about the dangers of excessive leverage and cultural complacency. Yet knowledge alone does not guarantee restraint. The headquarters had been filled with intelligent, experienced professionals, many of whom understood the risks intellectually. What failed was not awareness, but alignment between understanding and action. As the global economy slowly recovered, the memory of Lehman's fall remained uneven. In some circles, it was a warning etched into institutional memory. In others, it faded into history, overshadowed by new opportunities and rising markets. The building no longer housed the same institution, but the logic that once governed it had not vanished entirely. The true legacy of Lehman Brothers headquarters was not just collapse, but exposure. It revealed how systems built for growth can conceal their own breaking points, and how places of authority can normalize danger through routine. The question left hanging was not whether another crisis would come, but whether it would once again be born quietly inside offices that appeared stable, disciplined, and secure. As the years passed, the collapse of Lehman Brothers continued to influence decisions far beyond Wall Street. Inside financial institutions, a subtle shift occurred in how risk was discussed, measured, and justified. Yet the memory of what happened inside Lehman's headquarters also revealed something uncomfortable. Reforms often addressed structures, but rarely transformed mindset. Rules changed faster than incentives, and oversight expanded without fully resolving the tension between caution and profit. The headquarters had once embodied certainty. Its glass walls, modern architecture, and constant activity projected an image of control that shaped how employees saw themselves and how outsiders perceived the firm. This physical presence mattered. Power concentrated in one place tends to reinforce belief in its own permanence. Inside Lehman, proximity to influence created confidence that bordered on inevitability. When everyone around you assumes survival, doubt feels irrational. Sociologists and psychologists later examined how group dynamics inside such environments amplify risk. Shared language, shared goals, and shared rewards produce alignment, but also silence. Dissent becomes socially expensive. At Lehman's headquarters, questioning dominant strategies often meant questioning collective identity. Over time, skepticism softened, then disappeared. The building did not enforce silence, culture did. This dynamic extended to interactions with regulators and rating agencies. Meetings held within those offices framed conversations in technical terms that obscured emotional and ethical dimensions. Risk became abstract, reduced to percentages and probabilities. The human consequences of failure rarely entered the room. By isolating decisions from their broader impact, the headquarters functioned as a filter that removed empathy from strategy. The global response to the crisis revealed how dependent modern economies had become on trust. Once Lehman failed, confidence evaporated almost instantly. Lending froze not because money disappeared, but because belief did. This sudden absence of trust showed how fragile financial systems are when they rely on assumption rather than verification. Inside Lehman, trust in models and counterparties had been taken for granted. The collapse proved how quickly that trust could reverse. New institutions emerged with mandates to monitor systemic risk, designed to detect dangers that individual firms could not see alone. These bodies represented an acknowledgement that no single headquarters, no matter how sophisticated, can fully understand the consequences of its own actions. Yet coordination across borders, markets, and political interests introduced new challenges. Complexity was not eliminated, it was redistributed. For the public, Lehman Brothers headquarters became a symbol invoked whenever financial power was questioned. It appeared in documentaries, books, and debates as a reminder of what happens when concentration of influence meets unchecked optimism. The image of a single place contributing to global collapse resonated deeply, reinforcing skepticism toward large institutions that claim to manage risk on behalf of society. Inside the financial world, a quieter transformation occurred. Careers shaped by the crisis produced leaders more cautious in tone, if not always in action. Some carried the memory of Lehman as a personal reference point, a moment when certainty failed. Others, entering the industry later, absorbed it as history rather than experience. The difference mattered. Experience carries weight that lessons alone cannot replicate. The headquarters had shown how environment shapes judgment. Physical closeness accelerates decision-making, but can compress perspective. When consequences are distant, risk feels theoretical. Lehman's collapse forced recognition that distance does not diminish responsibility. Decisions made in one building can reshape lives across continents, even if those lives are never visible from the executive floor. As markets regained confidence, the cycle of growth resumed. Innovation returned, leverage crept upward, and complexity re-entered quietly. The shadow of Lehman lingered, but it no longer dominated conversation. This fading raised a critical concern. Memory is strongest immediately after disaster, but weakest when vigilance is most needed. The story moving forward was no longer about what Lehman had done wrong, but about whether its lesson would endure. Would institutions remember that collapse is rarely sudden and almost always cultivated? Or would the patterns repeat, refined but unchanged, inside new headquarters that look just as solid as the old one once did? As financial markets settled into a new rhythm, the deeper implications of Lehman Brothers' collapse began to surface beyond economics. Policymakers, historians, and cultural critics increasingly treated the headquarters not just as a site of failure, but as a psychological environment that shaped behavior. It became clear that architecture, hierarchy, and routine had quietly influenced how reality was interpreted inside the institution. When power is concentrated and repeated daily, it reshapes perception itself. Inside Lehman, success had been continuous for decades. That continuity bred a subtle form of certainty, the belief that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to manage. This belief was reinforced by daily reinforcement, by promotions, bonuses, and praise that rewarded alignment with prevailing strategies. Over time, the headquarters functioned like an echo chamber, where success validated assumptions and muted contradiction. The longer the firm prospered, the harder it became to imagine genuine failure. This pattern was not unique to Lehman, but Lehman provided its most visible expression. Other institutions observed the collapse with a mix of fear and reassurance, often concluding that they were different, better prepared, more diversified. Such thinking mirrored the confidence once held inside Lehman's own offices. The lesson was paradoxical. Everyone saw the danger, yet few believed it applied fully to them. The crisis also revealed how narratives operate inside powerful organizations. Within the headquarters, stories of resilience, adaptability, and innovation were repeated until they felt unquestionable. These narratives helped employees make sense of complexity, but they also filtered information selectively. Data that supported the story was emphasized. Data that challenged it required extraordinary proof. In this way, narrative became a form of risk management, one that protected identity more than stability. Outside the building, societies began to question the legitimacy of institutions that wielded immense influence without clear accountability. Public discourse shifted. Terms like moral hazard and systemic risk entered mainstream language. Trust, once extended automatically to major financial players, now demanded justification. The collapse inside one headquarters had altered expectations everywhere. In response, financial firms invested heavily in compliance, transparency, and communication. Yet these changes often focused on appearance rather than substance. Checklists replaced judgment, reports multiplied, complexity increased once again. The irony was difficult to ignore. Attempts to prevent another Lehman sometimes recreated the same conditions of opacity, only under different names. Former employees described the collapse as a moment of forced clarity. Many realized how much of their confidence had been borrowed from the institution itself. When the headquarters fell silent, that borrowed certainty disappeared. This experience reshaped careers, values, and perceptions of success. For some, it marked a permanent shift away from environments where growth was treated as an end in itself. The headquarters also became a reference point for discussions about leadership responsibility. Critics argued that decision-makers had failed to imagine worst-case outcomes. because imagining them threatened immediate rewards. Supporters countered that no leader could have fully anticipated the scale of the crisis. Between these positions lay an uncomfortable truth. Foresight was possible, but inconvenient. Inside Lehman, acknowledging danger too clearly would have required slowing down, reducing exposure, and accepting smaller gains. As the world adapted to new financial realities, the collapse of Lehman Brothers gradually transformed from a shock into a warning embedded in institutional memory. Yet warnings by nature fade unless actively maintained. The headquarters no longer housed the same firm, but the pressures that once filled its rooms remained alive in global markets. The question that persisted was not whether another collapse would occur, but where it would begin. Would it emerge in plain sight, inside offices that appear disciplined and rational, or would it grow quietly, normalized through routine, until it reached a point of no return? Lehman's story suggested that the most dangerous risks are often the ones that feel most familiar. And as new generations entered finance, the challenge became ensuring that this familiarity did not once again become blindness. As time created distance from the crisis, the collapse of Lehman Brothers began to occupy a strange place in collective memory. It was remembered as both a defining disaster and a distant anomaly. Inside financial circles, references to Lehman became shorthand for excessive risk, yet the daily pressures that had driven those risks never disappeared. Profit targets, competition, and shareholder expectations continued to shape behavior much as they had inside Lehman's headquarters years earlier. What made the collapse so instructive was not only its scale, but its ordinariness. Nothing about the daily life inside the headquarters suggested imminent catastrophe. Meetings followed schedules, reports followed formats, and authority followed hierarchy. The system functioned smoothly right up until it did not. This ordinariness revealed a profound vulnerability. When danger is embedded in routine, it becomes invisible. The headquarters had concentrated decision-making in a way that rewarded speed and confidence. Fast responses were celebrated, hesitation discouraged. In such an environment, reflection became a luxury. The financial instruments at the center of the collapse were not created overnight. They accumulated gradually, justified by prior success. Each layer of complexity made the system harder to question and easier to defend. The collapse, when it came, felt sudden only because its causes had been normalized for so long. Observers later noted that Lehman's failure exposed a gap between responsibility and consequence. Those making decisions inside the headquarters operated within incentives that emphasized short-term results, while the long-term costs were distributed across society. This imbalance distorted judgment. When personal reward is immediate and systemic risk is abstract, caution loses urgency. The headquarters did not invent this dynamic, but it amplified it. The global response attempted to restore balance through regulation and oversight. Capital requirements increased. Stress testing became routine, yet regulation itself faced limits. Rules could constrain behavior, but they could not replace ethical judgment or cultural awareness. Lehman's collapse demonstrated that compliance without conscience is insufficient. Inside the headquarters, many actions had been technically permissible while strategically disastrous. For communities affected by the broader recession, the story of Lehman was deeply personal. Job losses, foreclosures, and economic insecurity followed in waves. These consequences traced back, indirectly but undeniably, to decisions made far away. The physical distance between cause and effect had allowed responsibility to diffuse. The headquarters had served as a buffer, separating action from outcome. In academic and policy debates, Lehman became a reference point for discussions about systemic risk. Scholars emphasized that modern financial systems behave less like machines and more like ecosystems. Small changes can produce disproportionate effects. Inside Lehman, leverage magnified both gains and losses, turning local decisions into global shocks. This insight challenged traditional models that assumed stability through diversification alone. The building itself, once emblematic of dominance, became a reminder that permanence is an illusion. Institutions that appear invincible are often the most exposed to complacency. The headquarters had not failed because it lacked intelligence or resources, but because it trusted continuity too deeply. Success became evidence of safety when it should have prompted scrutiny. As markets evolved and new financial technologies emerged, the relevance of Lehman's collapse remained contested. Some viewed it as a product of a specific era, unlikely to repeat in the same form. Others saw it as a timeless warning about human behavior under conditions of power and complexity. The difference between these views shaped how seriously the lesson was taken. The unresolved tension lay in this question: can systems built on confidence ever fully guard against their own excess? Lehman Brothers headquarters suggested that confidence, when reinforced daily and rewarded materially, resists correction. It does not collapse from one dramatic error, but from accumulated certainty. And as the world continued forward, adapting and innovating, the final meaning of Lehman's collapse waited to be defined not by history alone, but by how future institutions would respond when faced with the same temptations, pressures, and illusions of control. The collapse of Lehman Brothers ultimately revealed something more enduring than financial loss. It exposed a pattern that repeats whenever institutions grow faster than their capacity for self-doubt. Inside the headquarters, confidence had not felt reckless. It felt earned. Decades of survival, innovation, and profit had trained the organization to trust its own momentum. That trust, reinforced daily, became indistinguishable from truth. What failed inside those walls was not intelligence, nor effort, nor even ambition. It was restraint. The inability to pause growth long enough to question its foundations proved fatal. Lehman's leaders operated within a system that rewarded continuation and penalized interruption. In such an environment, slowing down felt irresponsible, even dangerous. Yet acceleration without reflection carried a danger no model could fully measure. The story of Lehman Brothers headquarters is therefore not confined to one moment in 2008. It is a warning that extends to every place where complexity meets confidence. When organizations grow powerful enough, they begin to mistake survival for invulnerability. The building in Manhattan did not collapse physically, but the logic that governed it did, revealing how fragile even the most sophisticated systems can be. In the years since, financial markets have continued to expand, adapt, and innovate. New instruments replaced old ones. New technologies promised better control, yet the underlying human dynamics remained unchanged. Incentives still shape behavior. Narratives still filter reality. Success still silences doubt. The conditions that allowed Lehman to fail were not eliminated. They were redistributed. The global response to the collapse demonstrated both resilience and limitation. Economies recovered, markets stabilized, and institutions learned to operate under stricter oversight. But recovery can breed forgetfulness. As fear recedes, confidence returns. And with confidence comes the temptation to believe that lessons have been permanently absorbed. History suggests otherwise. Lehman Brothers headquarters stands in memory as a place where the ordinary produced the extraordinary. No single decision doomed the firm. No single room contained the whole truth. The collapse emerged from alignment, from many small affirmations reinforcing one another until alternatives disappeared. This is what made the failure so powerful and so difficult to prevent. The true cost of the collapse cannot be measured only in dollars. It reshaped careers, altered lives, and redefined trust in institutions meant to manage risk responsibly. It forced societies to confront the consequences of delegating immense power to systems that operate beyond everyday understanding. And it reminded the world that complexity, when paired with certainty, can become a liability rather than a safeguard. In the end, the headquarters became a symbol not of greed alone, but of belief unchecked by humility. It showed how easily rational people, working within accepted norms, can participate in outcomes they never intended. The tragedy was not malice, but normalization. Risk became familiar, and familiarity bred silence. The question left behind is not whether another collapse will occur, but whether it will be recognized while there is still time to act. Lehman Brothers demonstrated that the most dangerous moments rarely announce themselves. They unfold quietly, inside offices where everything appears under control, and when the next crisis comes, it may once again trace its origin to a single place, where confidence felt justified, decisions felt reasonable, and collapse felt impossible, until it was not.